Ever worry you might be leaving serious money on the table when negotiating a job offer? Most professionals are, and it's costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars across their career without even realizing it. So in this video, I'm going to show you the exact script that I've used to help more than 250 of my clients negotiate more than $30 million in new salaries, so you can walk into your next offer conversation confident, prepared, and ready to secure the best deal. And later, I'm going to show you exactly what it sounds like in a real conversation, because that's where I see most people get stuck. The salary negotiations don't get awkward because you're asking for more money. They get awkward because most people negotiate with statements and not questions. So think about it like visiting a doctor. If you walked into the doctor's surgery and they immediately give you a prescription without asking a single question, you'd probably be a bit concerned, right? Because good doctors, they start with questions. They ask about the symptoms, your history, and how long you've actually had the issue. Because until they understand the situation properly, they can't diagnose the problem. And they certainly can't prescribe the right solution. And all negotiations work exactly the same way. And I've seen this play out hundreds of times. One client of mine used this exact approach, and he increased his offer by nearly $18,000 simply by changing how he handled the negotiation conversation. And the rule to remember is the best negotiators don't start with statements, they start with questions. So I'm going to give you this exact script in two phases. Phase one is the questions to ask before the offer to build leverage. And phase two is questions to ask when the offer actually arrives to improve and increase the package. And by the way, if you wait until the offer stage to negotiate, you've already lost a ton of leverage, because it's a bit like trying to study for exam after it's already started. And the best negotiators, they start gathering leverage during the interview process, long before an offer is even discussed. Because by now you probably know that companies rarely have a single number. They've often got a salary range. And where you land on that range, well, it depends on the profile that they believe you are, your scope, your impact, your experience, or even your specialist expertise. So the smartest candidates, they ask a few professional, probing questions during the interview to establish how that range works and, critically, what it takes to land at the top of it. Because once you understand how the range actually works, the negotiation becomes much easier. So the first question is simple. It's this: could you share the salary range the company has in mind for this role? And this immediately gives you the context. Now you actually know what the boundaries are. And then move on to the second question. So what typically determines where someone lands within that range? Because now you're learning how the company actually makes the decision. They might say things like years of experience, leadership background, maybe technical depth, project ownership, or the impact on revenue or transformation. And that information is incredibly valuable, because now you can position yourself during the interview around that exact criteria. And that pushes you towards the top of the range. But here's one final question that very few candidates ask, but it's one of the most powerful. What would someone need to demonstrate to be considered at the top of that range? And that question does three things. First, it shows you think commercially. Second, it reveals what the company actually values most from the list. And third, it gives you a very clear target for how to frame your experience during the rest of the interview to hit that top of the range. Because once you understand what the top of the range looks like, you can then anchor all of your answers around that. And so when the offer finally does arrive, you're no longer negotiating randomly. You're negotiating from a position of clarity and leverage. And I've seen candidates increase their offer by 15 to 20K simply by asking these questions properly. And look, if this is already changing how you think about salary negotiation, this is the exact kind of insight I share with my clients weekly in the newsletter. There's a link in the description if you'd like to receive those emails. Okay, so that leads us on to phase two, which is when the interviews are finished and the offer is actually presented. Because now the key here is to guide the conversation with calibrated questions. But this is where a lot of people still get stuck, because it sounds good in theory, but they're not quite sure what it actually sounds like in a real conversation. So let me show you first. I want you to imagine you've just received an offer and the employer says, "We're really excited for you to join us. The offer is 120K. And most people might respond with something like, "Is there any chance the salary could be a bit higher?" But instead, you need to say this: "Thank you. I really appreciate the offer. Can I ask, how could we get closer to 135K? And now the conversation shifts, because instead of you asking for a favor, the employer might have to say, "Well, the budget is a bit tight at that level." But that's okay, because that's where you can follow up with "understood. So what would it take to move the offer closer to 135K? And then they might need to explain. It would likely require additional approval, or we might need to justify it internally. And that's great, because now you have something to work with. Because now you can start by reinforcing your value with something like, "That makes sense. One of the reasons I felt the range was appropriate is the scope of the role and the transformational work that we discussed earlier." Because at that point, you're no longer negotiating randomly. You're guiding the conversation based on what actually matters to them. And these are important questions because they introduce your expectations, they explore flexibility, and critically, they help the employer solve the problem, the gap, with you. Because now you're not just asking for more money, you're asking for how the deal can work for both of you. And here's the first question that introduces your expectations without sounding pushy or aggressive. You might simply ask, how close could you get to 135K? And remember, this isn't a random number because earlier in the interview, you asked about the salary range and what determines where somebody lands within that range. So when you ask this question, it's actually a loaded question because you already know what the range is and you already know what the top end number looks like. So now you're anchoring the conversation around that number. And it really means you're not demanding a number, you're inviting a conversation. And it signals that you're flexible, but it also clearly communicates where you believe the offer should reflect based upon your experience. But look, sometimes that person might hesitate. They might say the budget is tight, but that's where this next question becomes very useful. You ask, what would it take to move the offer closer to 135K? And this question is so powerful because instead of you having to justify why you deserve more money, the company now has to explain what's limiting their offer. Now, it may be the salary band is tight, maybe it requires approval, or maybe there's room, but it just needs to be justified internally. But either way, that's incredibly useful information for you because once you understand the constraint, you can start addressing it, maybe by reinforcing your impact, maybe by referencing the criteria they told you was required earlier for someone to hit the top of the range. And once you understand that constraint, the negotiation, it gets much easier. But sometimes the base salary truly is fixed, right? But that doesn't mean the negotiation has to be over. And this is where the next question becomes very useful. What flexibility might exist around an earlier salary review? And this question is so powerful because it solves a very common constraint. Sometimes the company simply can't move the salary today because of internal pay bands or budget cycles or whatever. But they may be able to review your salary sooner than normal. So instead of you waiting 12 or 18 months for a salary review, they might agree to revisit the conversation in 6 months. And if the role is going well, your impact is clear, that review might unlock the adjustment you were originally discussing. But look, if the salary itself truly is fixed, the negotiation doesn't have to stop there. And this is where the next question becomes incredibly useful. If the base salary is fixed, what other parts of the package might be flexible? And now the conversation, it expands beyond the salary because many companies have flexibility in areas like signing bonuses, equity, stock, maybe additional vacation days, an earlier salary review, or even performance-based increases. And sometimes those adjustments can be just as valuable as base salary. And once you're happy with how the negotiation has gone, there's one final question that brings everything together. And you close with this. How could we structure the package so it now works for both sides? And this is an excellent closing question. It changes the tone of the negotiation completely because instead of you just pushing for a higher number, you're inviting the employer to help design the deal. And when people feel involved in creating the solution, they're far more likely to support it. And so by now, the negotiations followed a very natural path. First, you introduced your expectation with how could we get close to 135K? You understood their constraint holding them back. So you asked, what would it take to move the offer closer to 135K? And then you explored the flexibility. What flexibility might exist around an earlier salary review? And then you smartly expanded the package. If the base salary is fixed, what other parts of the package might be flexible? And finally, you brought the whole conversation together with a collaborative close. How could we structure the package so it works for both sides? And once you've reached this point, the conversation is no longer awkward. You're not asking for a favor. You're not just pushing for more money. You're working together to structure a deal. And that's how professionals negotiate six-figure job offers. Because most professionals, they try to negotiate with pressure tactics. But the best negotiators, they negotiate with questions. And so one final thing to remember, salary negotiations are high stakes conversations. There's emotion and there's tons of pressure. And sometimes you just won't answer every question perfectly, or even in the exact order that we just discussed. And that's completely fine. The goal isn't just to follow a perfect script. The goal is to think like a negotiator. And in fact, one of the most useful principles in negotiation is this. The person asking the questions controls the conversation. So try to stay curious. Try to guide the conversation with questions instead of pressure tactics. Because when you approach negotiations this way, something important changes. The conversation stops feeling like a confrontation and starts feeling like two professionals working together to structure the right deal. And when you think about it that way, negotiating your salary stops feeling awkward and starts becoming one of the most valuable conversation skills you can develop as a professional. Once you start thinking about negotiations this way, you will dramatically reduce your chances of leaving serious money on the table every time an offer lands in front of you. But there is one more part most people miss. Even if you understand how to negotiate, you can still lose leverage before you ever even get to the offer stage. Because most professionals make a few critical mistakes during the interview process that quietly positions them as a lower value hire. And that's exactly what determines where you land on the salary range. So if you want to understand what those mistakes are and how to avoid them, watch this video right here.